Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this honor. And this may surprise some, but I also want to thank President Courtney for bringing this concurrent resolution, number 202. You can't ignore the string of victories. He's unbeaten. Mark Hatfield never lost an election. And he started right here, and he went over there, and he went to the Secretary of State's office, and you've heard all of this. He was the youngest governor ever elected, 36 years old. So some of you gubernatorial candidates, you probably better get going. And then 5 more elections to the United States Senate. Never beaten. But that's not what I want to talk about. Because I think the biggest political winner in the state of Oregon should be remembered for something else. He should be remembered for what he did for us. He should be remembered for who he was, and he should be remembered for how he treated us, Oregonians. There's a lot of biographies, there's a lot of awards, there's a lot of buildings named after him. Take the time sometime to walk across to Willamette University. See that library. You may hear a little more about this from my co-carrier. Take a look at The Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw, and you'll see references to the senator, a young, very proud patriot, a very loyal veteran, who, because of his experiences at Hiroshima, developed into a very fierce warrior for peace. This great man could be also self-deprecating and pretty funny. And one story came to my mind today. Some of you may have been at a breakfast honoring him just before he retired from the United States Senate. And he started telling stories on himself, very unsenatorial. And he told a story about grudgingly admitting that his hearing was going away. He didn't want to get hearing aids. And one day he was invited to a garden party in Washington, D.C., and his wife was out of town, so he took his youngest daughter. My youngest daughter's here today. And he wanted a clever way to ask this couple that he was talking to ask where they were from and what their background was. So he saw their children playing, and he said, "Those are beautiful children. Do they get to visit their grandparents?" Very clever, political ploy to get the answer. And the mom answered, "No, they're from the Middle East." And he said, "Well, that must be very hard to visit them." Horror came over the faces of the parents. And that's when the senator's daughter kicked him in the shins, pulled him out of the party, and said, "Dad, she said they're deceased. They're not from the Middle East." And he admitted that the next week he was fitted for hearing aids. He played on a national stage on our behalf. President Nixon had the brilliant decision-making power to pass over the senator at the last moment and choose Spiro Agnew for his presidential running mate. So think about that for a second. The youngest member of the Hatfield staff at the time in the 70s was a guy named Rick Rolfe, fresh out of Lewis and Clark College, and he talked the senator into actually trying an economic boycott against another country, which usually is not very successful, but it was against Idi Amin, the genocidal, crazy dictator of Uganda, who was totally propped up by one cash crop, coffee. He talked the senator into it, the boycott went into effect, it worked, and Amin fell. But the national stage, there are many more stories, but the national stage is probably not as important to us today as Oregon, because he always came back to Oregon. The minimum was once a month, the entire 30 years he was in the Senate. And I was reminded, talking to different colleagues this week, about stories I'd never heard, but great stories from every corner of this state that he loved. Stories from the representative from Aloha, stories from the representative from far eastern Oregon, and a story, or at least a reference to the representative from West Salem. I hope you'll hear some of those too as the debate, or at least the discussion, goes on. There were some magnificent tributes, including one in this chamber after we lost the senator in August 7th of last year, but none better than the two from his sons. Sons who had been in the public eye their entire life, had given up tons of time with their dad. But if you were here at either one of those services, you heard the great reverence and deep love of two sons. We're lucky to still have the senator's widow, Antoinette, living with us here in Oregon. She'd prefer to be called Mother H. What a great treasure, what a great partner. And I know that they were still writing little notes to each other in their 80s, like they were school lovebirds. It was very endearing. So at this point, I just want to be sure that the family, Mother H and Elizabeth and Marco, Teresa and Visco, know that a grateful state honors their husband and father today. During one of those eulogies, I guess, Sue Hildick, formerly with the senator's staff and now with the Chalkboard Project, paused for a minute in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, you were here. Chamber was full. Our chief clerk and their staff did a wonderful job that day of welcoming everyone. She paused for a minute and she said, I would like all the interns, volunteers, and staff people over this last 40 plus years career with Senator Hatfield to stand. And it felt to me like half the place stood up. It's a great legacy. On your desk is a really well-written essay by a friend of mine, Jack Robertson, who's the founder of the Northwest Hydrogen Alliance. Now, that'll be the last hydrogen reference today, but it's beautifully written, and I hope you read it. This singular leader, somebody once wrote, the senator from Central Casting, was a very impressive person to see. But he leaves our state with an imprint of a very humble servant leader. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to further discussion on this resolution.
Thank you much, Representative. Representative Gilliam, do you wish to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
He does.
I enjoyed all those, and thanks to my colleagues for those stories. Some I'd heard and some I had not. The vote on this resolution coming out of the Senate was unanimous, and I suspect that even though the representative from Clackamas indicated he was a holdout, that we might even get a unanimous vote today. And I appreciate my co-carrier, the representative from Beaverton, mentioning that we're not done honoring this man, and I'm grateful to the Rules Committee of the House for having our first informational hearing about the possibility of a statue honoring Senator Hatfield in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. So I look forward to working on that. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I guess I just would close by asking a question, which is, what's behind this type of person with this incredible balance that he possessed? And the answer for me comes in many forms, but this is a guy who saw Oregon, and I hope my friend from Happy Valley listens to this part. He saw Oregon both in square miles of wilderness that needed to be protected and millions of board feet that needed to be cut. This was a guy who was a lover of thousands of books, and as was referenced, a teacher of hundreds of young students and young minds. And as I mentioned, he was the winner of 12 straight elections. But the answer to why, the balance in his life, for me, has to be when you think of his personal faith and his belief in the teachings of Jesus. Now, I am not qualified or worthy to convey this part of his life, but I cannot omit it. I knew this would happen once. He didn't poll religious interest groups. He lived by the golden rule, which, as we know, is love others as yourself. There were no judgment, holier than thou pronouncements from him. He just believed that you'd do to others as you would have them do to you. So it really was more personal than just the teachings of Jesus. He just seemed to have a very deep forgiveness in his own life that he played out no matter what came his way, no matter what people would do or say about him. He just would not be exhausted in his desire to serve other people because of his love for his God. So I guess this most notable public servant, we always talk about public service, really was a very private servant, if you will. And he quietly prayed for his friends and his enemies every day. I think just like his friend Jesus would do.
Thank you, Representative.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I know it looked like it, but I wasn't quite done. Mercifully for all of you, I close. Gary Barber is a friend. Went to South Salem High, went to Willamette University. He was on the staff of Senator Hatfield. A Hatfield has-been like me. And he's a cancer survivor. And my friend from Beaverton knows this letter appeared after the senator passed away in the Willamette magazine. And I just want to read it quickly for you. At a campaign event in Portland, in '89, the senator was anxious to make sure he knew everyone in the room, so he stopped just feet from the doorway. He reached into his breast pocket of his suit coat and said, "Gary, did I ever show this to you?" It was a small note card, like the one senator used to jog their memory. But on this card were handwritten names of people, important people, heads of state, former presidents. And there was my name. He said, "This is my list of all the people I pray for every day." Gary, how long ago was it that you had your cancer? While I choked back tears, he proceeded into the room, greeted everyone by their first name like they were old friends, and they were. All Mark Hatfield staffers were taught this lesson early on. People are more important than issues, no matter their circumstances. I urge that we maybe make our own list, and I urge your aye vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.